to Maritha's History Corner's 10th video. Today we'll talk about Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots was born at Linlithgow Palace December 8, 1542. She became queen when she was only 6 days old. Her claims to the throne of England was almost as strong as her claim to the Scottish throne. As Henry VII of England's great-granddaughter, Mary was next in line to the English throne after Henry VIII's children. Given her youth and sex, the Scottish nobility decided that they must make peace with England, and they agreed that she should marry Henry VIII's son, the future Edward VI. No sooner had a treaty been arranged, however, than Catholics opposed to the plan took young Mary to Stirling Castle, and to Henry's fury, then broke the match, preferring to return to Scotland's traditional alliance with France. Henry thereupon ordered the savage series of raids into Scotland known as the Rough Wooing. His army set fire to the Abbey of Holyrood House, where James V was buried, burned corpses in the Tweed Valley, and set ablaze the border abbeys of Melrose, Jedburgh and Dryburgh. Undeterred, the Scots in 1548 betrothed Mary to the French King Henry II's heir, the Dauphin Francois, and sent her to be brought up in French court. Mary left Scotland August 7, 1548, when she was only 5 years old. 1 month earlier, her mother, Mary de Guise, Dowager Queen of Scotland, and her government agreed to marry Mary to the eldest son of King Henry II of France. The alliance was a natural next step, cementing the old friendship between the two countries, and isolating their natural enemy, England. And quite the enemy England had become, for all the family ties between the Tudors and the Stuarts. The young queen had spent the years prior to her departure being moved around the countryside to increasingly remote and fortress-like locations in hope of keeping her physically safe following the Battle of Pinkie, knowing Scotland had rarely been so vulnerable as when it had an infant on the throne. England had hoped to take advantage of the situation and force, cementing the takeover by the marriage of Mary to their own child king, Edward VI. The marriage alliance with France, on the other hand, was a bit of a double-edged sword, but the merits outweighed the risk. The physical removal of Scotland's sovereign from their borders might have been unfortunate, but it also guaranteed Mary's safety, and put both her person and her throne under the protection of the formidable Henry II. France had nothing to gain from English sovereignty over Scotland. On the contrary, surrounding England with the Franco-Scottish alliance was a net benefit. The marriage was controversial in Scotland, and there were many who not only wished to see the Queen remain in the country, but who wanted her to marry into a Scottish noble family. The simple fact that Mary was female put her reign at risk. In order to supply an heir, she had to marry, and her husband would then expect, and arguably be expected, to take over the reins of government. Mary's own mother was French, a member of the extremely powerful Guise family, with deep ties to the House of Valois. Mary's removal to France essentially strengthened her bond with the maternal branch of her family, placing her under the protection of her grandmother, Antoinette de Bourbon, Duchess of Guise. For her part, Antoinette was delighted by her granddaughter's arrival, and proudly reported on Mary's beauty and physical characteristics of the young queen that has remained deeply ingrained in her legacy. She was also remarkably bright, perhaps not on par with her Tudor cousin Elizabeth. but she was well educated, spoke several languages, and picked up French so quickly that, for better or worse, it became the language in which she was most comfortable the rest of her life. Mary was brought within the fold of the royal family, growing up alongside the nursery of Henry II's children by his wife Catherine de' Medici. Despite Henry and Catherine having married in 1533, they had only 3 children to their name in 1548 after nearly a decade of infertility. Their eldest son, the Dauphin, was Francois, was born January 19th, 1544. He was followed by 2 girls, Elizabeth and Claude, in 1545 and 1547. It was Elizabeth with whom Mary was the closest. The 2 girls were inseparable in their youth and maintained a friendship well into adulthood. Mary formally joined the royal nursery and her household on October 14th, 1548. Catherine and Mary's relationship was perfectly friendly and loving while Henry was on the throne, which makes sense given that Mary was a child. In stark contrast of the insecurity of Elizabeth Tudor, Mary's childhood was also remarkably secure. She split her time between her future husband's family and her geese relations, all individuals with much invested in her. For his part, when Henry finally made her acquaintance, he wrote, "She is the most perfect child I have ever seen." But for all that, this new environment may have been a boon to Mary personally. It was meant to prepare her to be France's Queen Consort, not Scotland's Queen Regent. Her surroundings was decidedly comfortable, bordering on opulent. The downside of this, however, was that by the time she returned to Scotland as an adult, she was used to the spaciousness and luxury of French chateaux, not the much smaller, dark, draughty, and utilitarian Scottish castles in her home country. She was raised Catholic, which would never have been any other way in the 1540s for a Scottish queen. But it meant she was wholly separated by the changing tides of religious feeling in Scotland over the next decade. And her only template for how to deal with Protestantism was how the French handled Huguenots. In September 1550, 2 years after Mary's arrival, Mary de Guise came to France to visit her daughter. Personally, the visit was a success, and mother and daughter became remarkably close, a bond that was maintained by letters after Marie's departure the following year. Politically, however, Marie earned herself few friends for appearing desperate for financial aid for Scotland, and repeated lobbying King Henry for funds. She was also there for the arrival of the English envoy, Lord Northampton, in the summer of 1551. Ostensibly, he was there to convey the Order of the Garter to Henry as a sign of diplomatic friendship. But he also took the opportunity to once again express that Mary would marry Edward VI instead of the Dauphin. The idea of a Tudor-Stuart alliance at this point makes a remarkable amount of sense. The problem with the notion, however, is Edward died in 1553. Another strange dynamic that Mary contended with, though it's unclear on how much she was aware, was the affair between King Henry and her Scottish governess, Lady Fleming. The first sign of the attraction came early on, when Henry took the time to write Mary de Guise that Lady Fleming was doing good in her duties, something that would have seemed strange coming from Henry or Catherine. There was, however, an etiquette to the role of mistress to the king, a significant facet of which was not embarrassing the king or humiliating the queen. Royal bastards, while permissible, were to be handled delicately. Lady Fleming, on the other hand, thought it advisable to declare loudly, in her thick Scottish accented French, "I have done all that I can, and God be thanked, I am pregnant by the king, for which I count myself both honored and happy." With that, she was promptly dismissed from her position as both Mary's governess and Henry's lover, and sent back to Scotland. On January 1st, 1554, at age 11, Mary was given her own household, marking the informal end of her childhood. Gone were the days of the nursery, and instead, she and the French princesses began to attend court more often, taking ceremonial roles in public and generally beginning a different sort of training, one that prepared them for the future as wives of important men. The funding of Mary's household was a tricky situation, given its expense, and it triggered the question as to who was responsible for her, the Scottish or the French. While the Scottish funded the household, it certainly wasn't a popular investment, and funds were tight. The situation grew into a full-blown domestic drama between Mary and her French governess, as the two argued over money and who was to blame for its shortage, with Marie de Guise scolding from the background from Scotland. Mary's biographer, Lady Antonia Fraser, writes, "The dispute does reveal significantly the direction in which Mary Stuart's character was developing. There is a vein of near hysteria in some of the letters to her mother on the subject. She was passionately upset at the notion that the love of her mother might be turned away from her by the troublemaking efforts of this woman. She rebukes with anguish the notion that she who is generous should be unfairly described as mean. The episode suggests that from adolescence onwards, Mary Stuart was strangely sensitive on the onslaughts of criticism, which she had good reason to feel were unfair. Meanwhile, Mary was shuttling towards her future. 1553 had seen the death of England's King Edward and, after an ill-fated rebellion, to put the Protestant Lady Jane Grey on the throne. The succession of his older Catholic sister, Mary Tudor. By the end of 1557, as Mary turned 15, she was not decidedly of age to marry. A Venetian ambassador wrote on November 9, 1557, "The causes of hastening the marriage are apparently two. The first, to enable them more surely to avail themselves of the forces of Scotland against the kingdom of England for next year, and the next for the gratification of the Duke and Cardinal of Guise, the said Queen's uncles, who by the hastening of this marriage choose to secure themselves again the matrimonial alliance which might be proposed to His Most Christian Majesty in some negotiation for peace, the entire establishment of their greatness having to depend on this, for which reason the constable, by all means in his power, continually sought to prevent this." At the dawn of 1558, France and Scotland negotiated the terms of the young couple's marriage, for while Mary would take the title of Dauphine as Francois' wife, it also opened the question of what Francois would be to Scotland. It was deemed appropriate that he be given the power of the crown matrimonial by the Scottish government, which essentially made him king with the same authority as regnant that his wife held. The only courtesy they held back was shipping the crown to France for Francois to formally be crowned on his wedding day. Then there was the question of the succession, particularly in the case of Mary's death. In the early months of the new year, Mary signed a secret treaty that stated that if she died before her husband without children, Scotland would be handed over to France. Secondly, Scotland's revenue would be the property of the French crown until it was reimbursed for the money it had paid to help Scotland in its wars against England. And thirdly, she renounced any arrangement she might later make that would interfere with these terms. Included in this was also the question of Mary's right to the English throne, which were considerable, particularly in light of religious friction. Henry VIII's multiple edits to the succession had left the room for debate, as had Edward VI's final will, which had attempted to bar Mary I from the throne. With Mary I ailing and childless on the throne, there were two leading potential successors: her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth and her Catholic cousin Mary. Mary's claim to the English throne was a fair one, if you believe Elizabeth to be either a bastard, a heretic, or both. Mary's father, James V, was the eldest surviving son of James IV and his wife, Margaret Tudor, herself the eldest daughter of Henry VII. Traditionally, should Henry's heirs die out, the royal line would have reverted back to Margaret's descendants. However, despite Mary I's preference for Mary Stuart's religion, the fact remained that the latter was due to Mary, the future King of France. It was one thing to watch Scotland be engulfed by France. It was another to risk England becoming a mere French territory. In the end, nationality came before religion. Nevertheless, Mary Stuart signed the secret treaty, empowering Francois to inherit her claim to the English throne and pass it along to his successors, whether they were children with another wife or his brother in the event of his death. Had Francois outlived her, the course of European history would have been blown wide open. On April 19, 1558, in the Great Hall of the Louvre in Paris, Francois and Mary were formally betrothed. Antoinette was standing in as Mary de Guise's proxy. The wedding took place in the Cathedral of Notre Dame on April 24th, in a ceremony and celebration that perfectly showcased the excess and drama of the French Renaissance. The capital was full of French and European royals and nobles, making up an impressive procession of riches through the city streets. Included in the guests was 10-year-old Henry of Navarre, the future King Henry IV and father of Henrietta Maria, future Queen of England. As for Francois and Mary themselves, their pairing was an interesting one, particularly given how much more significant it could have been had Francois been a different man, or boy, as the case may be. Personally, they were essentially childhood friends, and Mary had done a good job presenting herself in her youth as a friendly, safe confidant for the future king. He repaid her kindness by falling in love with her, though given his age, it was likely nothing more than essentially a schoolboy crush. Mary was beautiful, feminine, and excelled at all the courtly skills, dancing, hunting, and hawking, that women were expected to enjoy. As for what she felt for him, it's unclear. His physical frailty and limits were unlikely to inspire passion, but she developed at least a fraternal love for him. 7 months into the marriage, the matter of the secret treaty came to a head, at least internally, when Mary I died on November 17th in Westminster. She was swiftly succeeded by the 25-year-old Elizabeth Tudor, who was duly crowned and accepted by the majority of the English as a legitimate queen. Such was not the case in France, where Henry II immediately dictated that the coat of arms used by Francois and Mary should include those of England alongside those of France and Scotland, acknowledging Mary's right as the true Catholic Queen of England. Needless to say, the move wasn't popular with Elizabeth. Then there was the matter of Spain, who had been closely allied to England, thanks to the marriage of Mary I and Philip II. Now that the marriage was over and childless, Philip tried his hand with Elizabeth in hopes of maintaining his foothold in the country. The move failed, and he turned his attention instead to an alliance with France. On June 21st, 1559, Philip took his third wife, Henry and Catherine's daughter Elizabeth, and Mary's closest childhood friend. Because Elizabeth was only 14, her departure to Spain was delayed until the autumn. However, in due course, she joined her new husband's court and enjoyed a remarkably happy marriage to a man that had caused his Tudor wife so much grief. Despite never meeting again after her departure from France, Mary later said that she maintained memories of great nostalgia for her former sister-in-law throughout her life. In the near term, however, the marriage sidelined England for a triple alliance of France, Scotland, and Spain. Pretty much their worst-case scenario. They were only saved, in part, by the untimely death of Henry II on July 10th, 1559, thanks to a jousting accident. His death vaulted Francois and Mary, then 15 and 16, to the French throne. However, the couple were too young to rule. Instead, Catherine moved from her domestic and ceremonial role as queen consort to the nominal regent. In actual fact, Mary's uncle, the Duke of Guise, and the Duke of Lorraine, recently married to Francois' sister Claude, staged a coup and barricaded themselves in the Louvre with the young couple. The management of Guise and Lorraine was defined by their attitudes towards heresy, particularly in the light of the growing number of French Huguenots, more than a few of whom were within the ranks of the nobility. Their attitude towards it, supported by the new Spanish alliance, was ruthless, violent, and led directly to an incident known as the Envoys Conspiracy, in which powerful Protestant nobles attempted a coup to oust Guise and Lorraine. Francois and Mary were moved from Blois to Amboise when word reached the court, and the rebellion never truly was, resulting in a handful of its participants' arrest in March 1560. Meanwhile, Protestantism was growing far away in Scotland, putting considerable pressure on Mary de Guise's government. France was tied up in its own domestic needs and was unable to offer troops. Instead, they sent diplomats who effectively placed a bandage on an open wound. On June 11th, 1560, Mary de Guise died in Edinburgh, leaving the question of who would rule Scotland and how open. More to the point, it presented England with another opportunity in the wake of French and Scottish chaos to right the wrongs done by Mary's assumption of the title Queen of England and jeopardize France's power monopoly led by Spain. But Elizabeth I was not a fighter by nature. She was a diplomat. Her correction of the situation resulted in the Treaty of Edinburgh, signed July 6th, which ensured peace between England and Scotland. Withdrew English and French troops from Scotland. Mary, for her part, refused to ratify the treaty and was focused on mourning her mother, to whom she had been deeply attached. By the autumn, Francois was unwell. He collapsed on November 16th and died a few weeks later, December 5th, at Orleans, likely of a middle ear infection. His reign had lasted 17 months, and he was succeeded by his younger brother, King Charles IX. As for Mary, she became the Dowager Queen, a powerless position. Childless, she no longer had a reason to remain in France, despite it being her home for the last 12 years. Now 18 years old, it was time for Mary to return to Scotland. Catholic in beliefs, French in sentiment and thoughts, and Scottish only by birth. She arrived in Leith, August 19th, 1561, to begin a 7-year hands-on reign that will make her infamous. Scotland was now an officially Protestant country. She was a Roman Catholic, but her half-brother, Lord James Stuart, later Earl of Moray, had assured her that she would be allowed to worship as she wished, and in August 1561, when she returned, she got an unexpected warm welcome from her Protestant subjects. At first, Mary ruled successfully with moderation, advised by Lord James and William Maitland of Leighton, a subtle diplomat. However, her marriage in 1565 to her second cousin Henry, Lord Darnley, great-grandson of Henry VII, initiated a tragic series of events, made worse by factious Scottish nobles. Spoiled and petulant, Darnley became the tool of Mary's enemies, and with a group of conspirators that bursted into her supper chamber, threatened the heavily pregnant queen, and murdered her secretary, David Rizzio, on March 9th, 1566, inside the palace of Holyrood House. The birth of Mary and Darnley's son, James, that summer, did nothing to improve their relationship, and when Darnley was murdered at Kirklefield, just outside the walls of Edinburgh, on February 10th, 1567, people suspected that she was implicated in the crime. Her subsequent marriage, 3 months later, to the Earl of Bothwell, generally believed to be the principal murderer, brought her inevitable ruin. Her Protestant lords rose against her, and her army confronted theirs at Carberry Hill, near Edinburgh, on June 15th, 1567. She surrendered and was imprisoned at Lochleven Castle, and forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son. Bothwell fled to Denmark in Scandinavia, where he was arrested and held prisoner until his death. Mary escaped Lochleven in 1568, only to be defeated at the Battle of Langside, near Glasgow, on May 13th. Fleeing south, she sought shelter in England, believing that Queen Elizabeth I would support her cause, but instead she was kept in captivity in England for 19 years. The focus of a series of a Roman Catholic plot against Elizabeth, culminating the English Queen, led to Elizabeth's ministers demanding Mary's execution. Mary was finally executed at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire on February 8, 1587, at the age of 44. She was buried in Peterborough Cathedral, but in 1612 her son James VI and first had her body exhumed and placed in the vault of King Henry VII's chapel in Westminster Abbey. Well, that was all for this time. Stay tuned. The next video will be out April 11th and it will be about the Four Marys.